Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about sociology in Australia, which can be seen as progressing in three principal stages. In stage one, Australia was regarded as a data mine for the metropole, and by metropole I mean the homeland or the mother city of an empire, the United Kingdom in the case of the British Empire, even London. The colonies such as Australia are thought of as the periphery. In the early days of Australian colonisation, the UK and Europe were often regarded as the centre of the civilised world and could be seen as the metropole. People like Charles Darwin came to Australia and wrote about what they saw, that is, the Aboriginal owners of the land. And Charles Darwin wasn't hostile to these groups of people at all. He admired their bushcraft and hunting skills. He sympathised with their vulnerability to imported disease and did not blame them at all for any violent resistance. However, he did regard them as more primitive people than British people. Other theorists never visited Australia, yet Australia became this data mine, a place where data could be generated from, a source of ethnographic examples of the so-called primitive. And within the colonised world, Australia had the distinction of being the most primitive of all. So by the 1890s, pioneering ethnographic work was being done, and some of that happened in Australia, particularly around Alice Springs. Native tribes of Central Australia, for example, was read in 1899 with great enthusiasm by Durkheim and his colleagues, and it became the main empirical basis for Durkheim's last book, The Elementary Forms of Religious Life, which he published in 1912. The book outlines the customs and the mythology of the Ariente people as they stood in the late 19th century, and it became the basis for a general sociology of religion. Durkheim, like most sociologists who wrote about Australians, understood little of the diversity of Aboriginal culture. For example, Durkheim knew there were many different communities, but thought their cultures were homogenous. Durkheim thought he'd found in this ethnographic work a detailed description of the most primitive form of religion, and he thought by studying this most primitive form, he could reveal the most fundamental truths about religion. And this is what he said. In this book, we propose to study the most primitive and simple religion which is actually known. A religious system may be said to be the most primitive in the first place when it is found in a society whose organisation is surpassed by no others in simplicity, and secondly, when it is possible to explain it without making use of any element borrowed from a previous religion. Not everyone agreed with Durkheim. The anthropologist Van Gennep, for example, pointed out that Australian societies are very complex, very far from the simple and the primitive, and very far along their own paths of development. And that was a quote from 1913. The first Australian text on sociology was written by a man called W.E. Hearn, an Irish classicist who became professor at the University of Melbourne in the 1950s. William Edward Hearn, his name is, and he was born in Ireland and educated at Trinity College. His dates are 1826 when he was born, and he lived through until 1888. In 1854, he was chosen by a committee acting in London for the newly established University of Melbourne to be appointed as the first professor of modern history and literature, political economy and logic at the University of Melbourne. Apparently he was one of 4 original professionals and was attracted by the salary. The themes in his 1878 book, in which he identifies with Europeans, and that book is called The Aryan Household, he was concerned with early social institutions such as the family and the household, of the supposed progenitors, I guess, of Western European people. And his themes were customs, the position of women, the social organisation of the household, the types of power relationships, the relationships between the state and the population. So he did make a contribution to sociology, a contribution from the colonies back to the metropole. He did speculate on social progress, but he didn't actually establish sociology in a university. Francis Anderson is the next person that I want to talk about. He was educated at the University of Glasgow, and before that he had been a pupil teacher at the age of 14, which was not an uncommon thing at that time. He came to Australia in 1886 as an associate of Charles Strong and his Australia Church, which was a very progressive church with a commitment to social justice. And Anderson was appointed to the University of Sydney in 1888, teaching logic and mental philosophy, and he taught English classes in the evening. He was very passionate about education and interested in what's known as the WEA movement, the Workers' Educational Association movement. And the WEA was founded in 1903 in the UK as a provider of adult education. And by adult education, it was mostly designed for working class people working during the day who could then get some education during the evening. Anderson was very critical of rote learning. He wanted teachers training in a college and encouraged discussion in his classes, rather than just the teacher presenting a lecture. And he proposed reforms in the university, such as the broadening of its requirements, what were called then the matriculation requirements. He wanted them to include English rather than just Latin, a foreign language, mathematics, and a science, and a new chair in economics as well, as he believed that economics should not be taught in purely financial and commercial terms without teaching it within a broader political and social context. There was no chair in sociology at this point, but he did put forward a case for teaching sociology in Australia, and he presented that to the Australasian Association for the Advancement of Science in 1911, and there was a resolution passed recommending a chair in sociology, and by a chair in sociology that would mean the establishment of a staff member responsible for teaching a particular discipline or field of knowledge like sociology. So sociology itself was first taught in Australia in 1914, but it was taught in these WEA classes. Remember what I said, the Workers' Education Association. So that was adult education. It was a commitment to widening education. So it was kind of night school for the working classes, established first in South Australia in 1914, and was an attempt to bring together working class organisations sitting outside the university and bring them together with university. And the first courses offered in was offered in 1917, I think, to 231 students, and they were all held at the University of Adelaide. There was one to be held at the Trades Hall, but that was cancelled, unfortunately. The introductory subjects were economics, English literature, psychology, and modern world history, and it reflected the aspirations of the founders who wanted to encourage working men, and it was mainly men, although women would have gone along too, who had no access to university education, wanted to encourage these men to undertake social and political studies in order to equip them to become effective leaders of working class movements, not just in Australia but also overseas. Within a few years, it was very clear that the WEA was actually attracting the middle classes, so not just the working classes, but from the middle classes, it was primarily women, particularly women with not necessarily any political ambitions, but they wanted an education. And they developed a whole lot of social activities through membership of the WEA club, and that club was set up in 1920. And these activities were very popular, as were skills-based courses in public speaking and music, and they were introduced in 1922. In that year, in 1922, there were 480 students who attended, and over a quarter of them nominated their occupation as domestic duties, and about a half were women. So from 1918 to 1920, classes were held in rural centres as well, including Hamley Bridge, Port Pirie and Freeling. And participation by women, some argue, was really not surprising because of the involvement on the WEA Council and executive of the Women's Social League, the Women's Non-Party Political Association, which was a forerunner of the League of Women Voters, and the Women's Political Education Society and the Education Union as well. So, encouraged by the University of Adelaide and assisted by small government grants and financed by profits from its bookshop, the WEA grew, surviving both the Great Depression and the Second World War. And when formal links with the university ceased in around 1957-1958, the WEA opened a teaching centre on South Terrace, and they're now located in Angus Street. South Australia is the largest of the 4 remaining branches of the WEA in Australia, and like its counterparts in Sydney, Newcastle and Wollongong, it survived by resisting amalgamation with other organisations and not relying too heavily on government funding. And it's done that by diversifying its sources of income. And the South Australian WEA, I don't know if you've ever attended classes, now offers nearly 1,800 courses annually to over 30,000 adults, and the majority of students are under 45, and and 2/3 are female students as well. So that's some of the potted history of the very first sociology courses that were taught in Australia. They were taught in universities, but actually through these WEA classes, which were located within the universities. One of the first, and best known, I guess, Australian-bred sociologists was Elton Mayo, who was born in Adelaide, and I think he's on one of the Making History flags around the University of Adelaide, if you'd like to look out for that. He got a Bachelor of Arts with first class honours in 1910, majoring in philosophy and psychology. And in 1911, he became Foundation Lecturer in Mental and Moral Philosophy at the new University of Queensland, and in 1919 held the first chair of philosophy there, and that position held through until 1923. In Brisbane, Elton Mayo was very much a public figure, lecturing for the WEA, the Workers' Educational Association, and serving on the university's new the War Committee. Influenced, as he was, by Freud, Jung and Pierre Janet, he studied the nature of nervous breakdown, and with another physician in Brisbane, Matheson pioneered the psychoanalytic treatment of shell shock. These days we would call that trauma, but that used to be called shell shock, the impact of being in war on soldiers. But he moved on from there as well, observing the disturbing level of what he saw as industrial strife and lots of political conflict in Australia. He went on to formulate an analogy between war neurosis and the psychological causes of industrial unrest. And drawing on social anthropology, he argued that the workers' morale or their mental health depended on their perception of the social function of work. And Mayo saw the solution to industrial unrest in sociological research and industrial management rather than in radical politics. And then what he did was he left Australia for the United States in 1922, and through a Rockefeller grant that enabled him as a research associate at the University of Pennsylvania to investigate the high labour turnover at a particular textile mill. And this work attracted the attention of the Harvard School of Business, where he was appointed an associate professor in 1926 and then professor of industrial research in 1929. And there he joined and designed investigations into personal and social factors determining work output at another organisation, the Western Electric Company. in Chicago. And these were very famous experiments, were really quite path-breaking in modern social research. So he was one of the most influential social scientists of his day, although he was also somewhat controversial too. Another somewhat controversial figure was Oscar Oser, who was born in South Africa in 1904. And in 1946, he took up the foundation chair of psychology at the University of Melbourne. And under his leadership, the department quickly became one of the largest in the British Commonwealth. And his early research, Oscar Oser's early research, was very diverse. It centred on the constraints that social roles placed on individual expression and development. And he did part from fashionable laboratory investigations. Instead, he built on his wartime experiences and training in physics by turning to theoretically informed empirical studies in applied social psychology. From 1948 to 1970, he and his colleagues, and they were supported by the government, by industry and by United Nations, they researched and published monographs on the social structure of urban and rural communities. They were interested in conflict in factory work, group dynamics in classrooms, and the limited roles available to farmers. They're also very interested in industrial relations, particularly at places like Broken Hill and the mines up there. And he produced 3 volumes called Social Structure and Personality. So he's very much interested in how society impacts on the individual. Roy Morgan, you will no doubt have heard about. He set up a research institute during the 1950s doing social surveys on the white community. And these surveys, the Gallup poll, which is still going, were reported in the press. They got noticed by politicians. And then they sort of formed the basis for a whole range of other surveys which began appearing. And they were both university and kind of welfare-based surveys describing specific social groups and their problems, for example, aged people in Victoria or the young in Sydney. And so kind of around this point, Australia ceased to be a data mine, an economy exporting facts or imagined facts. Instead, most of the studies which were published in Australia were actually unknown in the metropole. So the tendency in Australia was to import methods and topics from the metropole, and by now that had shifted to not just being the United Kingdom, but also the United States would see as the kind of the centre of the empire as well, so that Australia became a branch office of metropolitan society. And the commonest sort of sociological research was really to examine a topic from overseas and add in Australia. So religion in Australia, for example, or social stratification in Australia, marriage in Australia, women in Australia, leadership in Australia, etc. So we're now kind of up to stage 2 of sociology in Australia. So there was no sociological theory being produced here. This was all imported. Therefore, works on Australia would be accompanied by first deferring to metropolitan theory and methods. And as I say, that had shifted post-war so that it wasn't just the UK, which was seen as kind of the centre of the empire, but also the United States. And then we'd import the metropolitan theory methods, topics, and then use local data as well. And that became very much an entrenched pattern. Australian sociologists then got published, so it was kind of pragmatic too. So Australian sociologists got published in metropolitan journals, and for good reason. There would be a lot of a much wider audience, obviously, than publishing for Australia, and more prestige. But in order to publish in these journals, Australians did have to mimic the style of the metropolitan journals. And so with that, Australia wasn't seen as a site of difference anymore, but really as a site of, I guess, similarity as well. But most of the sociological work was primarily around the white settler society and Aboriginal culture tended to become more the business of anthropology, which in Australian University was the older and more prestigious discipline. So it was seen as better than, anthropology was seen as better than sociology. And at the time, this was a boundary that Australian sociologists did not challenge. So Aboriginal people were of interest to sociologists, however, as a disadvantaged group in a system of social stratification, often as an ethnic minority, along with recent migrants, ironically. So sociology becomes a thing in Australia from the 1930s, and you can see there the various courses was taught in social work, for example, by Amy Wheaton at the University of Adelaide from 1930 to 1942, and gradually it was added to other university courses, and the Australian Sociological Association was formed first in 1989. And then I just wanted to talk to you about some people who were early on key figures in Australia. Jean Martin, for example, was appointed Foundation Professor of Sociology at La Trobe University, and her dates are 1923 through to 1979. And she was the first woman sociologist the first woman sociology professor in Australia. And accepting the position at La Trobe, she had a very clear set of priorities, and what she wanted to do was, first of all, develop the Department of Sociology. Second, she wanted to develop sociology as a discipline or as a field of knowledge, and third, she wanted to continue her own academic research, and fourth, she wanted to nurture young sociologists, and a fifth point there, she also wanted to make a contribution to the development of Australian public policy in the area of social welfare and social reform. So she wanted her research to actually have a public impact. She had studied anthropology at the University of Sydney and then moved to sociology, and she did various projects on women, for example, working in stocking or hosiery factories. She investigated dairy farmers working in New South Wales. She was interested in refugees in New South Wales in the post-war period. She was interested in developing a mixed methods approach as well. And another high priority for her was the development of the Sociological Association of Australia and New Zealand, which was being set up back in 1963, and she played an indirect but important kind of behind-the-scenes role, and then later served as the president from I think it was 1969 through to 1971. Lois Bryson is another important figure. She first encountered sociology as a social work student at Melbourne University, and it seems to me quite logical that sociology would form the underpinning of social work education. She worked as a social worker, she worked as a teacher, a public servant, and a sociologist, and became a professor of sociology at the University of Newcastle in 1990. Her book, Australian Newtown, was published in 1972, and a later book is Social Change, which was published in 1999. Another huge major leader in Australian sociology, Raewyn Connell, has made her mark through her theoretically important and innovative contributions to the understanding of lots of areas, really, of social life, and especially gender issues. She also has a major interest in education, particularly education at universities as well. A kind of a significant feature of her writing is that while she's theoretically really well grounded, she's insightful, she's creative, she's also focused very much on important day-to-day life issues, and unlike a lot of academic writing, she's very accessible to read as well as illuminating, and so she speaks to audiences well beyond academics and their students as well, so she's got a very broad audience. Connell's influence within Australian sociology was really well illustrated by the results of a 2004 survey of members of TASA, and which asked them to name the books by Australian sociologists that had most influenced their work, and 4 of the top 10 were written by Connell. And prior to 2000, she'd been the sole author of 7 books, joint author of 7, and solely or jointly written over 100 refereed journal articles and 40 chapters for edited books. So she's not only theoretically innovative and creative, she's not only accessible, she's also incredibly prolific as well. Much of her early writing and research focused on social class and inequality, but she's probably become best known for her extensive work on gender issues relating to girls, boys, women and men, and an early book of essays linked sex, class and culture, 3 elements that remained really central to all of her work. So first published in 1987, Connell addressed gender as a large-scale social structure as well as a personal issue involving identity. So she suggests, for example, that if a woman is defined hierarchically, so that the male idea of a woman defines womanhood, and if men have power, this idea becomes reality. Her work is very much informed that of Barbara Risman, who argues that gender is a social structure and should be examined as such. Masculinity is broadly concerned with similar issues, was first published in 1995, when male gender issues were really just coming to the fore and becoming subject to more extensive sociological analysis and discussion. And this has since been her most internationally cited work, so her most internationally acclaimed and influential book, ahead of Gender and Power. It's been cited like more than 17,000 times. As with Raewyn's other work, it is concerned not only with the theoretical but also with practical issues and with promoting social change. And to this end, she examines the experiences of the feminist and liberation movements and how they've contributed to understanding the politics of masculinity. And she also discusses the knotty problems associated with shifting men from their generally privileged social position. She acknowledges that not all men are socially privileged, but generally wanting to shift them. And to do this, she suggests that the goal should be to recompose rather than delete the cultural elements of gender, and I'm quoting there from page 234. Her book Southern Theory was published in 2007 and is still in print, and it shows how social theorists are constructed from the global north and from the global north points of view. And it then has 5 chapters telling the stories of social thinkers from sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Iran, India and Australia. And we'll pick up some of her work later on as well. So, sociology in Australia primarily continues on stage 2 path, where the metropolitan theory is hegemonic, and think about some of the theorists that we've been talking about this semester, and not just us talking about it in our class, but who are very popular across the university as well, particularly, you know, 2 huge figures, for example, being Bourdieu and Foucault. These days, Australian sociologists are well respected in the metropole, and I've listed there a few: Claire Burton, John Braithwaite, Michael Pusey, Jack Barbalet, Pauline Johnson. So they have impacted on the back in the metropole of the global north, as Raewyn calls it as well. So stage 3, sociology in Australia is about new ways of doing things. And we do have a few examples. Sociologist Vivian Johnson, for example, used some Aboriginal social concepts for examining a new wave rock band called Radio Birdman, which unfortunately is now out of print, so we can't, you'll probably be able to get a copy of that somewhere, but not easily, if you want to have a look at her work. And then Chilla Bulbeck's important 1988 book asked the question about whether it is possible to have a united international feminism given different situations of women in different countries and resistance to the dominance of white Western feminism. And the book should be available in the library. Professor Maggie Walter was awarded her PhD in sociology from the University of Tasmania in 2003, and she's currently a professor of sociology within the School of Social Sciences. And she's a descendant of the Aboriginal people of northeastern Tasmania. And Professor Walter, is a leader in Indigenous higher education and Indigenous research capacity building at the national and international level. And she's particularly interested in participatory action research. So that's where you don't go and do research on a group of people, but you invite that group of people in, and then you develop your research agenda in consultation with a group of people, and then you'll go and make changes and take it out to the community and invite them back in to discuss those changes. So you're working together with a community, not imposing a research agenda on a community at all, and so that everybody becomes the active participants in that research project. A couple of other people that I'll mention, but I'll leave you links to look up their work. For example, Professor Kathleen Butler, and we've read some of her work, so I'd encourage you to look at her. And Dr. Zavalos as well is coming not from an Indigenous perspective, but certainly coming from an ethnic minority perspective, and she sees herself as another sociologist as well, and I'll leave you the link with her work as well. So we do have a few people coming through who are interested in new ways of doing sociology in Australia. So, in summary, sociology in Australia began as the primitive being studied back at the metropole, but from the 1950s, sociology in Australia added Australian data to metropolitan theory and methods. And from the 1980s, there's a whole lot more sensitivity to recognising the hegemony of the global north, and there's a beginning now of doing things in different ways, and certainly acknowledging that hegemony and wanting to shift some of our ideas. So thank you.